Hey everybody, Craig here from Independent Drum Lab, and today I want to show you my favorite way to mic a kit using the Recorderman technique. I think it's the perfect way to mic a kit with a minimal mic setup. Today I just have two overheads and I have a microphone out in front of the bass drum as well. This setup gives you a very natural sounding mix just by setting up the microphones in this configuration. Now, close miking or spot miking your drums does give you a full sound and full control over individual drum levels, but it ultimately doesn't give you a full, accurate, true-to-life sound of the kit. Nobody plays and listens to the drums with their ears right up against the drum like the microphone is. It's ridiculous. You want your microphones to pick up an accurate, true-to-life sound. In our INDe videos and sound demos, we want to show you the most accurate sound of our drums. I even recorded an album using this Recorderman technique, and it sounds amazing. Now let's hear that drum sound now. See? I mean, it sounds great. The Recorderman method, in my opinion, is the way to go for a minimal mic setup. It gives you a stereo image of the kit. It picks up the snare drum and the bass drum extremely well. This overhead mic is directly above the snare drum, and this microphone over my shoulder here is pointing directly at the snare drum. So it keeps the snare drum and the bass drum centered in the track while giving a full stereo image of the entire kit. And it doesn't pick up a whole lot of room noise. Even if you're playing in a living room or in a basement and your room isn't very sound treated, it's still going to sound really well because this technique does not pick up a lot of room sound. All right, so let me show you how to exactly set up these microphones in the Recorderman technique. Okay, welcome to this side of the kit and welcome to this side of the kit. To start off with, what microphones am I using today? I'm using two Shure KSM32 condenser microphones, and I'm also using a bass drum mic. About 1.5 inches in front of the bass drum is the AKG D112 bass drum microphone. So setting up this Recorderman microphone technique, it all starts with this guy right here, this snare drum overhead microphone. So this is important because we're going to base the position of the shoulder microphone off of the position of this snare drum overhead mic. So to roughly start, we want to get this microphone about 2 drumstick lengths above the center of the snare drum. So to do that, you pick up your drumsticks and we're going to stack them up on top of each other from the center of the head, going straight up, and boom, look at that. My drumsticks, the tip of my top stick is just barely touching the mesh of the microphone there. So there's my position for this top microphone. And for reference, little tape measurer. For me, your case may vary if you're using longer or shorter sticks, but this is a great starting point. But for me, this microphone is 32.5 inches above my snare drum. 32.5 inches. Okay, so once we have this microphone placed, it's directly above the snare, 2 drumsticks length away, roughly, at least for me, 32 inches. We now want to get this shoulder microphone set up. Now, how do we do that? We could, again, do the drumstick technique. Stack them up, just barely touching that top mic, and now we're going to bring this over. Boom. Just barely touching this shoulder mic. Top mic, shoulder mic. My drumstick is coming the same distance away from hitting both microphones. Now that's a great rough way to get started in placing these. A better way, I always start with the drumstick technique, but then I'll swap over to using just a microphone cable. So what I do with this microphone cable is I take one end and I pin it down to the bass drum head with my bass drum beater. So I'm just pushing my beater up against the head with the cable in between. So now it's taut and my bass drum beater is holding that cable in place to the batter head of my bass drum. Now with one hand, my right hand, I bring this cable up to where it's just touching this top microphone. And then I take my left hand and I take another point on the cable and I pin it down to the snare drum head. So now I adjust a little bit, get my lengths right. So there, this cable is just now barely touching this top microphone. And it's pinned up against the bass drum head, and it's also pinned against my snare drum head. So now I'm going to bring this over to my shoulder mic. And so now we know that both microphones are equidistant from the snare drum head and the bass drum head. So, why is this important? It's because phase. We want these microphones to be equidistant for phase purposes. If your microphones are out of phase, if they are different distances away, if you're thinking of sound waves, if I hit my snare drum, that snare drum sound wave may travel to one microphone and hit one microphone before it hits another. So in your DAW, your recording software, your waveform between your different microphones, they're not going to line up. And so that means your microphones are out of phase. When you're out of phase, you get kind of a hollow, weak sound to the kit. It's not as full as it should be because your waveforms aren't lining up. With this technique, making sure both microphones are equidistant, it gets rid of all your phase issues. Your microphones are automatically in phase. If you get them nice and close, equidistant, you don't have to do any work in your DAW. I use Logic Pro. You don't have to go into Pro Tools or Logic and mess around with all this stuff and flipping polarity and stuff. You don't have to do that because these microphones are automatically in phase. As for where to aim this shoulder microphone, we want this microphone to be aimed. You have a couple of different options to either be aimed at the center of the snare drum or aiming at your bass drum beater as close as you can get it, or kind of somewhere in between. I tend to aim it somewhere in between, maybe kind of at at least the way I set up my kit, sort of towards the outer edge of the snare drum. That way it's still picking up the snare, it can get this tom really well, and it's picking up some bass drum beater sound. This top mic picks that up as well, but aiming this microphone either at the center of the snare, either at the bass drum, or somewhere in between. You may want to record a little bit, pointing at the snare or pointing at the bass drum and find which sounds best to your ear. But to me, getting kind of a mixture of both works great. In your DAW, since we want a nice stereo sound of the kit, I like to pan this top microphone about 32 to the left, and then same with this right microphone, 32 to the right. The Recorderman technique is great at keeping your snare drum and your bass drum perfectly centered in the mix. Making sure that they're equidistant from each other, that puts those two instruments dead center. So we pan this a little bit to the left, I do 32. Pan this to the right, I also do 32 on that. We get a beautiful stereo full sound of the kit while maintaining the snare drum and bass drum centered in the mix. And that's really it. It's that simple. A couple of drumsticks, do your fine measurement with a string or a mic cable that you have laying around, and that's it. I like to also throw the bass drum mic out in front, but you don't have to. This Recorderman technique picks up the bass drum fairly well. So now what I'll do next is I'm going to play the drums, and I will show you how this microphone setup sounds, and I'll also show you how it sounds without the bass drum mic. So I'll occasionally mute and unmute the bass drum mic so you could hear how well just these two microphones pick up the bass drum. All right, here we go.